Hey, it's Amy Shaw here. I had another video that I had to make today. So I thought, well, I had my camera out and I'm here, I'm ready. I'll just make a video for my YouTube channel. I have a super long list of videos, topics that I want to talk about, and I just can't seem to get to them. But today, after the heavy video I just made, I thought it'd be fun to do a little bit more playful one. So today I want to talk about the Desert Files, another video for my Desert Files playlist. I have a really long list of topics for the Desert Files too. So I just quickly reviewed that. And I think today what I want to talk about is Steve. This guy named Steve when I lived out in the desert. So Steve was an interesting man. My ex-husband, we were married for 9 years. We were together about 11 or 12 years. And, you know, the desert town, it's very small. My ex-husband was 9 years older than me, so he kind of came from a different generation. So his circle of friends, like from high school and stuff, was a little bit different than my circle of friends. And he had been in the desert a lot longer than I had, so he knew a lot of people. He just knew a lot of people, you know, from a lot of different, you know, sort of generations. And he was really good at meeting people and bringing people home. So I have quite a few experiences actually. That's how I stumbled into actually the peyote ceremony, which I'm not going to talk about today. I'll talk about that in another video. But it was through my ex-husband, just, you know, meeting people and just being the way he was. So he was always dragging people home. And one day he drug home this man named Steve. And over the years, you know, I had several different interactions with Steve. Once he knew where we lived and knew who we were, he just kind of seemed to pop up. So Steve was a schizophrenic by, you know, the world standards. He allegedly had a family. He allegedly had a wife and 3 kids, and then came down with symptoms of schizophrenia. I never met his wife or children. I don't even know where they lived. But Steve lived in this little tiny dumpy motel right on the highway there in Yucca Valley. And he was on Social Security. What would happen is Steve would get his Social Security money, and he was incredibly naive and gullible and kind. And so a lot of the drug addicts and those type of people would come around as soon as Steve got his check, and can I borrow money? Can I borrow money? And this would happen, and Steve was generous. He would, you know, give them the money, and then he wouldn't have any money to pay his rent. And so he would get kicked out of the motel, and then he would kind of go wander around in the desert, and then Social Security would cut him off because they're sending his checks to the motel address, and the motel was sending them back saying this person doesn't live here anymore. And so then he'd get cut off Social Security. And so 2 or 3 months he'd be wandering around in the desert homeless, and then he'd come back and, you know, get it all fixed up again and get back. And then, so this was a cycle. This was a pattern over several years of knowing Steve. That was sort of his pattern. Steve was an interesting guy. He was very exotic looking. He, you know, almost looked Middle Eastern. He had sort of olive colored skin, really dark, almost black, not quite black though, a dark brownish black. Curly hair, beautiful soft curls. It was shoulder length most of the time that I knew him, maybe a little bit longer. He definitely did have symptoms of schizophrenia. So he was a very interesting man. I remember one time we were taking him somewhere, I don't even remember where, but he was in the back of our car. And as we were backing up out of the parking space, you know, he starts yelling, he throws his hands up and he starts yelling, hot, 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 hot. So he had a lot of curious, really quirky behaviors. I remember one time Steve showed up at my apartment. It was summer, and he was wearing nothing but like this, I don't know what you call him, like, I don't know what you call him, like this loincloth thing. I mean, it basically was like this piece of fabric that was like wrapped up, covering, you know, his private parts, his front area, and it like almost like a sumo wrestler type outfit, but it wasn't that. It was similar to that. Anyway, he was completely naked otherwise. That's the only thing that he had on. So I heard a knock at my door, and I opened it up, and there was Steve, practically naked in his little, thing. And he kind of had a Jesus complex. He thought he was Jesus. So he was coming back out of wandering out in the desert dressed like that for a little while. And he wanted to take a shower and get some food. And for me to braid his hair. Such an interesting man. So I wasn't afraid of him. I mean, by that point I knew who he was. We'd had many interactions with him. So I let him in. He took his shower. He wanted me to braid his hair. So he sat down, like I sat in a chair like I'm sitting in now, and he sat down on the floor, and I literally braided his hair. It was a very visceral, bizarre moment, and I connected, and I was young. I was maybe like 18. Yeah, probably about 18 years old. My son, my oldest son, who's 28 now, was just little tiny infant, maybe a toddler, young, maybe, I don't know exactly, but he was still an infant basically. And it just, that connecting in that whole experience in that moment, it was like this very archetypal feeling of like, Mary Magdalene braiding Jesus' hair or something. It was just so bizarre. But one of the things, and he did sort of have this Jesus complex, but one of the weird things about it is I remember like lifting up his hair, as I was like scrunching it back to braid it, and he had 666 tattooed on the back of his neck, and it's the first time I'd actually seen that tattoo. So I didn't say anything to him, but I just thought, well, that's a very strange dichotomy, right? That's very strange, very weird. He didn't have any other tattoos. I never saw any other tattoos. I mean, he showed up at my house, in this stupid little shrong, this thing with sandals, like Jesus sandals on. And I didn't see any other tattoos on his body. Such an interesting man. So, yeah, I don't know. I really don't know what that was about. And then there was another time after I was no longer married to my ex-husband that Steve showed up. He didn't show up at my house because by that time I had moved, deeper into Joshua Tree. I lived 2 miles down the road, so nobody really just randomly showed up at my house at Joshua Tree, 2 miles out in the desert. But I think we saw him in town or something, and he was saying he was hungry and he wanted a shower. Again, I think it was summertime, and he had on these really thick, like mittens, gloves, like knitted gloves, and black. And he was dressed, normally, pants and a shirt, but he refused to take the gloves off. We brought him home, and he showered, and I made him dinner, and I believe it was chicken, and he was picking it up and eating it with his hands, but he wouldn't take his gloves off, and the greasy chicken was getting all over his gloves, and it was kind of gross, and I was like, Steve, take your gloves off, but he absolutely refused. He would not take his gloves off. So he was a very curious individual with a very curious life pattern, and I just wanted to tell that little story about Steve and honor him. Gorgeous man. He had an interesting, almost Middle Eastern look to him, that olive skin, that black curly hair. He had gorgeous eyes, like that famous National Geographic cover of the girl from Afghanistan, the young woman from Afghanistan with those piercing eyes. He had eyes like that, where they just set off on his skin tone in this just piercing way. And curiously, he always had this smell, almost like, it wasn't like you would think a homeless person, and I say smell, and you probably want to go, ew. No, it was like, I don't know if it's a product he used in his hair or what, but it was almost like a coconut oil that you put on yourself, like a suntan lotion, a sun Hawaiian Tropic, or it had that sort of odd, sweet, coconutty smell to it. He always smelled like that. And, just an interesting guy. Usually he was clean shaven, but sometimes he would have this really light sort of just mustache, this real thin mustache, but he would sometimes have this real thin, mustache on his lip. And, he was just a really interesting guy. I don't know. Steve. I think about him a lot. I wonder if he's, you know, still living, and if he's still living out there, and, you know, sort of if he's still in that pattern of, you know, homelessness and, you know, staying in the motel, and you know, what's actually become of him. Unusual, interesting, quirky, beautiful man, beautiful man. And I used to always think about his family too, you know, because I knew that he had a family, but he never talked about them. He hadn't seen them in years. I didn't really ask or pry a lot, you know, because our conversations were usually, you know, a bit on the schizophrenic side of the spectrum. So I, you know, didn't pry a lot into the emotional aspects of his life. He usually seems like he had either a completely flat affect, or he was slightly anxious and aggravated. So he kind of stayed in that state most of the time, and I didn't really, you know, try to agitate him more. Although I wasn't afraid of his agitation. You know, usually was not directed immediately towards me or other people. It was more circumstantial, you know, like him throwing the hands up, hot, 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 hot. You know, he would have a little bit of moments like that, where he would like jump real quick, you know, or just, you know, yeah, I was sensitive to certain things for whatever reason, but, yeah, so that was Steve. I don't even remember what his last name was, but Steve from Yucca Valley, who would wander around in the desert thinking he was Jesus in his little, you know, Jesus sandals and his little loincloth. So I hope you enjoyed hearing about Steve, and have a great day as always. Thank you guys for watching my videos, and I love you guys so much.